The quiet hum of the city outside was a stark contrast to the tension brewing inside Caleb McKinley's penthouse office. Behind closed doors, the billionaire CEO was deep in a heated phone call, his sharp voice cutting through the thick silence of his meticulously organized space. Stacks of reports and documents towered on his mahogany desk, a testament to his endless workload. The dim glow of his sleek desk lamp cast long shadows, emphasizing the weight of yet another high-stakes business deal, the merger with Ava Hastings, a name that had been giving him a persistent headache for weeks. Beyond the heavy office doors, however, an entirely different scene was unfolding. Henry McKinley, 7 years old and full of uncontainable energy, was sprawled across the living room floor, pushing his toy truck along the smooth wooden surface. His bright eyes flickered toward his father's office every few minutes, lips pursed in a thoughtful pout. He knew his dad had been stressed lately, grumpier than usual, as Henry liked to put it. He'd heard Caleb muttering about deadlines and negotiations in that serious, no-nonsense tone that made adults take 2 steps back. But Henry wasn't afraid of him. He just wished his dad would smile more. Then, the phone rang. A soft, persistent trill sliced through the silence, coming from the sleek landline on Caleb's desk. The sound was quickly followed by an impatient sigh from behind the office doors, then a muffled, "Just a second," before the phone kept ringing. Henry's curiosity got the best of him. He scrambled to his feet, tiptoeing toward the slightly ajar door, peeking in like a tiny detective on a secret mission. Caleb was nowhere near the phone, still caught up in his conversation, with a determined nod because grown-ups always made things more complicated than they needed to be. Henry slipped inside and clambered into his dad's oversized leather chair. The caller ID flashed Ava Hastings, a name Henry had heard before, a lot, usually accompanied by groans, sighs, and the occasional grumbled "unbelievable" from his father. But that didn't matter. Henry had already made up his mind. With the confidence only a 7-year-old could possess, he pressed the green button and chirped, "McKinley Industries." Hi. Silence. Then, a surprised yet smooth female voice came through the speaker. "Oh, hello. I was expecting Mr. McKinley." Henry swung his legs back and forth, grinning at the ceiling. "Dad's busy talking about boring stuff. I can take a message." A soft laugh floated through the phone, light and amused. "That's very professional of you." Henry puffed up with pride. "I know, right? I'm Henry. Caleb McKinley's son. Who are you?" A pause, then a chuckle. "I'm Ava Hastings." "It's nice to meet you, Henry." Henry beamed. "Nice to meet you too. Did you know my dad is super nice and single?" Cue Caleb choking on his drink. In the span of a second, the once calm office exploded into chaos. Caleb stumbled into view, eyes wide with horror, his coffee nearly slipping from his grasp. His brain struggled to process what he had just heard, and for the first time in a long time, the billionaire CEO, renowned for his calculated precision, was utterly speechless. Henry, completely oblivious to the storm he had just unleashed, continued swinging his legs happily. On the other end of the line, Ava remained silent for a beat. Then, she laughed, an unmistakably delighted, genuine laugh. Caleb groaned internally. He was never going to live this down. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button, like, and share this video to keep the good vibes rolling and inspire me to create more exciting content for you. Caleb McKinley was still trying to wrap his head around what had just happened. His 7-year-old son, his own flesh and blood, had just blindly volunteered him for a date with Ava Hastings. Of all the ways this evening could have gone, this was nowhere on the list. He stood frozen, coffee mug halfway to his lips, staring at Henry, who sat perched in his massive office chair, looking far too pleased with himself. The sound of Ava's soft laughter still echoed through the phone speaker, and Caleb's stomach twisted. He had spent months negotiating a high-profile merger with Ava Hastings, navigating corporate battles, strategic counteroffers, and razor-sharp discussions, and now, thanks to his tiny matchmaking prodigy, he was one step away from an accidental date. Caleb cleared his throat, quickly stepping forward and plucking the phone from Henry's grasp. "Miss Hastings," he said, voice clipped, trying to salvage the situation. "I apologize for—" "Oh, no need," Ava interrupted, her tone light, but tinged with unmistakable amusement. "Henry has been nothing but delightful." Caleb groaned internally, massaging his temple. "Yes, well, I do have to say," she continued, clearly enjoying his suffering, "he makes an excellent pitch, super nice and single. Hard to ignore a review like that." Caleb pinched the bridge of his nose. This woman was toying with him, and he had no idea how to steer the conversation back to neutral ground. Before he could respond, Henry, still swinging his legs happily, perked up and said, "Miss Ava, you should take Dad to dinner. He really likes that Italian place on 5th. A pause, then, laughter. "Oh." Ava mused, clearly entertained. "Italian, huh, yeah." Henry nodded enthusiastically. "He loves the garlic bread. He says it's the only decent one in the city. You should totally go with him." Caleb felt his soul leave his body. "Henry," his voice was low, bordering on pleading, but it was too late. Ava hummed, as if she were actually considering it. "Well, that does sound like a tempting offer." Caleb held his breath. There was a beat of silence. Then, Ava chuckled again, and with far too much confidence for his liking, she said, "How about it, Mr. McKinley? Dinner at the Italian place on 5th. Or should I take my business elsewhere?" Caleb almost choked. What was happening? Was she seriously doing this? Was Ava Hastings, one of the most formidable businesswomen he had ever met, actually inviting him to dinner with his own son acting as an unlicensed wingman? This had to be a trap, a power play, a tactic to throw him off his game before the next round of negotiations. Right, Caleb opened his mouth to decline, to explain, to say literally anything logical, but then he made the mistake of glancing at Henry. His son was staring at him with the biggest, most hopeful eyes imaginable, eyes that practically screamed, "Say yes." Caleb clenched his jaw, battling between corporate logic and the desperate need to not crush his son's enthusiasm. His hesitation must have been obvious, because Ava, still sounding far too amused, added, "Oh, come on, Caleb. It's just dinner." "Just dinner," Caleb repeated, mostly to convince himself. Henry nodded encouragingly. "You'll have fun," Caleb exhaled sharply. He was going to regret this. "Fine." "Perfect," Ava replied smoothly, as if she had known he would cave all along. "I'll make the reservation, 7 o'clock. Caleb closed his eyes. "Sure. Looking forward to it," she said, her voice dripping with amusement. Then the call ended. The room fell into silence. Caleb slowly turned to face Henry, who was beaming like a CEO who had just closed the biggest deal of the year. "You're welcome," Henry chirped. Caleb let out a long, suffering sigh, running a hand through his hair. "Henry," he started, already regretting the impending disaster. "You can't just—" "Did she say yes?" Henry interrupted, bouncing slightly. Caleb glared. Henry's smile widened. "She did, didn't she?" Caleb groaned, rubbing his temples. "Henry, this isn't—" "See, Dad." Henry grinned, unfazed. "You just need to trust me." Caleb could only stare at his son, half exasperated, half impressed. This kid had negotiated a dinner date better than some of Caleb's own board members. Henry hopped down from the chair, patted his father's arm like a tiny business coach, and said, "You're going to do great." Then, before Caleb could formulate a response, Henry skipped out of the office, humming to himself. Caleb collapsed into his chair, already dreading what he had just agreed to. A dinner meeting, with Ava Hastings, at his favorite restaurant, all because his 7-year-old had become his personal matchmaker. Wonderful. Caleb McKinley wasn't nervous. He was a billionaire CEO. He had sat across from world leaders. So then why was he currently checking his watch for the 3rd time in as many minutes, standing outside an upscale Italian restaurant, feeling like he was about to walk into a trap. He exhaled sharply, adjusting the perfectly knotted navy blue tie that Henry had insisted made him look less grumpy. Henry, this was entirely his son's fault. A sharp gust of wind cut through the evening air, but it wasn't the cold that made Caleb's pulse quicken. It was the sight of Ava Hastings emerging through the crowd, walking toward him with an effortless grace that somehow made him forget how to breathe. She was composed, elegant, and completely at ease, as if she hadn't just roped him into a dinner he wasn't prepared for. Her long, tailored coat hugged her form perfectly, and as she approached, her lips curved into a knowing smirk. Caleb suddenly wished he had taken a stronger drink before coming here. "Mr. McKinley," Ava greeted, tilting her head slightly, eyes gleaming with amusement at his dumbfounded expression. He managed to clear his throat, desperately hoping he didn't look as flustered as he felt. "Miss Hastings," he replied, keeping his voice cool, controlled, professional. Ava raised a brow. "Thanks for agreeing to this." Caleb tensed. There it was. The moment where she would reveal her real intentions, whether this was truly just a dinner or another business move to throw him off his game. He started to respond, but she cut in before he could even form a thought. "Although, I have to admit, Henry was a pretty compelling salesman." Caleb groaned. "Of course." Ava's smirk widened, thoroughly enjoying his discomfort. "You should listen to him more often." Caleb exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair before opening the restaurant door for her. "Trust me, Henry already thinks he runs my life. Let's not encourage him." Ava chuckled softly as she stepped inside. The restaurant's warm ambience was a sharp contrast to the cool evening air outside. The scent of fresh garlic bread, simmering tomato sauce, and roasted herbs filled the space, making Caleb feel marginally less tense. The hostess led them to a private table near the window, offering a panoramic view of the city skyline bathed in golden lights. Caleb took the seat across from Ava, trying not to focus too hard on the fact that this, whatever this was, felt suspiciously an actual date. The first few minutes were filled with formal pleasantries, both of them keeping the conversation strictly professional. Ava brought up the merger, her voice smooth and controlled as she inquired about financial structures, projected growth margins, and possible stakeholder pushback. Caleb, relieved by the familiar business talk, effortlessly countered with his own analysis. For a moment, he almost believed he could get through this evening without incident. Then, the garlic bread arrived. Ava reached for a piece, smiling slightly as she tore it apart. "So, Henry mentioned this is your favorite." Caleb stiffened. "That little traitor." "I don't have favorites," he said, a little too quickly. Ava arched a brow, completely unconvinced. She took a bite, moaning softly at the taste before laughing at the scandalized expression on Caleb's face. "Okay, I have to admit, Henry was right. This is amazing." Caleb muttered something under his breath before finally giving in and taking a piece for himself. The moment he did, Ava's smirk deepened. "See, not so hard to admit you like something, is it?" Caleb glared. "Are we here to discuss the merger? Or are you trying to interrogate me about my food preferences?" Ava leaned forward slightly, her eyes twinkling. "Why not both?" Caleb sighed, already regretting this entire evening. But as the minutes passed, something shifted. Ava started steering the conversation away from business, subtly yet effectively. She asked about Henry's favorite school projects, about Caleb's experiences as a single father, about how he managed to run an empire while raising a 7-year-old who clearly had a future in matchmaking. Against all odds, Caleb found himself relaxing. He told her about the time he nearly burned down the kitchen trying to make Henry's birthday cake. He admitted that family game nights usually ended in dramatic betrayals over Monopoly. He even without thinking told her about Henry's childhood habit of falling asleep clutching a toy spaceship, mumbling about saving the galaxy. Ava listened, genuinely listened, her sharp business exterior softening with each story. And then, She did something unexpected. She admitted that she bribed her own nephew with ice cream to behave during board meetings. Caleb nearly choked on his wine. Ava laughed, shaking her head. He's 7. I was desperate. You try keeping a kid entertained while running a company. Caleb shook his head, grinning despite himself. For the first time since this dinner started, he realized something shocking. He was actually enjoying himself when the waiter returned with the dessert menu. Caleb glanced at his watch, startled by how much time had passed. He had barely thought about the merger. Ava, watching him carefully, rested her chin on her hand. You seem surprised. Caleb hesitated. This wasn't what I expected. Ava's lips twitched. Good surprise or bad surprise? He held her gaze for a beat longer than necessary. Good, he admitted. Ava's smile widened, warm and genuine. Maybe we should do this again sometime, he found himself saying before he could second-guess it. Ava pretended to consider it. Her eyes filled with mischief. Another business dinner. Caleb hesitated. Something like that. Ava's smirk turned victorious. I'll hold you to that, Mr. McKinley. By the time Caleb arrived home, Henry was waiting. Sitting at the foot of the stairs, his son's eyes sparkled with excitement. So, Henry demanded, grinning like a miniature villain. How was business? Caleb sighed, shrugging off his coat. Go to bed, Henry. Henry's smirk only grew. Did you at least hold her hand? Caleb groaned, pinching the bridge of his nose. Henry. His son laughed, dashing upstairs far too pleased with himself. Caleb watched him go, shaking his head. But as he walked toward his office, he realized something. Despite the chaos, despite the matchmaking disaster, despite the fact that Ava Hastings was entirely too good at getting under his skin, he wasn't dreading the next dinner. Not at all. The next morning, Caleb really tried to convince himself that last night was just a business dinner. It wasn't. He had barely mentioned the merger. He had laughed, more than once. He hadn't even checked his phone during the entire meal, something practically unheard of in his world. And worst of all, he didn't regret it. That was the real problem. Caleb spent most of the next day inly preparing for their follow-up dinner, going over financial figures and potential rebuttals like a man rehearsing for a high-stakes trial. By the time evening rolled around, he was convinced he had a solid strategy that lasted all of 5 seconds, because the moment he stepped into the restaurant, he was thrown completely off balance. Ava was already there, seated with a glass of wine in hand, her signature smirk firmly in place. You clean up nicely, she greeted, eyes glinting. Caleb, still feeling unsettled by the way his pulse reacted to her presence, cleared his throat. Hope I didn't keep you waiting. Ava waved a hand. Not at all. Besides, Henry warned me you might be late. Caleb stilled. He what? Ava's expression was pure amusement. Oh, you didn't know. We had a lovely little chat on the phone earlier. He told me all about your terrible work-life balance and how I should make sure you have fun tonight. Caleb groaned, dragging a hand down his face. He was going to have words with that kid. Ava's eyes twinkled. He also mentioned you're a sucker for garlic bread. Caleb sighed. I need to find a way to revoke his talking privileges. Ava laughed, warm and unguarded. Somewhere in the back of his mind, Caleb realized he liked that sound too much. As dinner progressed, Caleb's well-rehearsed business strategy went up in flames. Ava, completely ignoring any attempt to steer the conversation toward financial forecasts, had other plans. So, what's your favorite movie? She asked casually, sipping her wine. Caleb blinked. What? Ava arched a brow, her smirk deepening. You do watch movies, don't you? Or is that too inefficient for a billionaire's schedule? Caleb scowled. Of course I watch movies. Oh, then what's your favorite? Caleb hesitated. Then before he could stop himself, he said, Henry would say it's the one with all the space battles and confusing timelines. Ava's lips twitched. Ah, I see. A man of refined taste. Caleb sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "I'm going to kill him." Ava laughed again, shaking her head. "You know, for someone who insists this is a business dinner, you're awfully bad at keeping it professional." Caleb paused, and then he realized she was right. He hadn't once checked the financial reports he had printed earlier. He hadn't even mentioned the merger. Instead, he had spent most of the night talking about Henry's disastrous Halloween costume choices and how Caleb had been forced to sit through an entire animated series about talking dogs. He had let his guard down, and that was dangerous. Ava, watching him carefully, tilted her head. "Relax, Caleb. I don't mind. This is more fun." Caleb swallowed. He needed to end this conversation before he got into deep. "Right, sorry. I should." Ava leaned in slightly, cutting him off. "Maybe we should do more business dinners, then." His brain short-circuited. Was she flirting with him? Ava's smirk only deepened, as if she knew exactly what was going through his mind. Caleb, for the first time in a long time, found himself at a complete loss for words. By the time Caleb made it home, he felt more off balance than ever. And of course, Henry was waiting for him. The kid was perched on the stairs, grinning like a miniature evil mastermind. "So?" Henry asked, far too smug for someone under 4 feet tall. "How was business?" Caleb exhaled sharply, shrugging out of his coat. "Go to bed, Henry." Henry's smirk only grew. "Did you at least hold her hand?" Caleb groaned, rubbing his temples. "Henry, did you kiss her?" Caleb glared. Henry giggled and skipped upstairs, cackling like a little gremlin. Caleb sighed, rubbing a hand down his face. This was a disaster, because despite his best efforts, despite every attempt to convince himself that Ava Hastings was just another business associate, he knew he was lying to himself, and worse. He had a feeling Henry knew it too. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button, like, and share this video to keep the good vibes rolling and inspire me to create more exciting content for you. Caleb McKinley was a man of logic, precision, and calculated decisions, and yet, over the next few weeks, logic failed him completely. Because somehow against all reason Ava Hastings had become a regular part of his life. At first, he told himself that their increasing dinners were strictly strategic, an effort to keep negotiations amicable. But then, the invitations started to blur the lines. Ava would text about a new restaurant opening, complete with a winking emoji. Caleb, without thinking, would reply before he could talk himself out of it. And before he knew it, he was sitting across from her again, drinking wine and debating the best takeout in the city. This was a problem, because he wasn't supposed to enjoy her company this much. Henry, on the other hand, was thriving. If Caleb had any lingering doubts that his son was conspiring against him, they vanished when he caught Henry standing on a chair, rearranging bookshelves in the living room. Caleb folded his arms, watching with suspicion. "What are you doing?" Henry, completely unbothered, placed a hardcover novel at a very deliberate angle. "Making things look nice for Miss Ava," he said, hopping down with a satisfied grin. Caleb sighed. "She's not coming over, Henry." Henry smirked. "Not yet." Caleb groaned. This kid was going to be the death of him. The next dinner was supposed to be quick and professional, just a follow-up on merger contracts. But when Ava walked into the restaurant wearing a red dress that made Caleb forget how to form sentences, he knew he was doomed. "You look, wow," he said before he could stop himself. Ava smirked, clearly amused by his momentary lapse in composure. "I'll take that as a compliment." By the time they finished their meal, Caleb couldn't remember half of what they had discussed, and the worst part, he didn't care. At this point, Caleb should have known that resisting this was pointless. But the real moment of no return came one evening. When Henry pulled out the big guns, he peeked around the corner of the office, far too casual. "Dad, you should go to the gala." Caleb, distracted by work, barely looked up. "It's a pointless networking event." Henry shrugged. pretending not to care. Miss Ava might be there. Caleb froze. Henry, sensing weakness, pushed further. Plus, you can talk business and stuff. Maybe invite her. Caleb narrowed his eyes. Henry, his son's face was the picture of innocence. It's not a date, obviously, Henry said. Barely suppressing a smirk, Caleb exhaled through his nose, already feeling cornered. Fine, I'll ask her. Henry fist-pumped silently on his way out. That evening, Caleb stared at his phone for a full 10 minutes, typing and deleting messages. Finally, he settled on a short, professional invitation. Before he could change his mind, he hit send. The reply came almost instantly. Sounds fun. Looking forward to it. Caleb stared at the winking emoji. Half horrified, half intrigued. From the hallway, Henry peeked in. Catching his expression, she said yes, didn't she? Caleb huffed. Go to bed. Henry grinned. You're welcome. On the night of the gala, Caleb adjusted his tie for the 5th time, glancing at the door every 2 seconds. When Ava stepped through, he forgot to breathe. Her dress was dark green, elegant, but effortlessly confident just like her. Her hair fell in loose waves, framing her face, and when she caught him staring, she smirked. You clean up nicely, McKinley. Caleb, for once in his life, couldn't think of a single clever response. Ava laughed softly. Good to know. The evening passed in a blur of handshakes and polite smiles. Caleb tried to focus on the speeches, but every time Ava's arm brushed his, he found himself struggling to remember what they were even talking about. She was charming, effortlessly composed, chatting with board members like they were old friends. At one point, she leaned in, voice low. You're staring. Caleb jerked back, flustered. Ava chuckled. Relax, Mr. McKinley. I don't mind. Caleb groaned internally. He was never living this down. When the band started playing, Ava arched a brow. Do CEO stance, Caleb snorted. Not well, she smirked. We'll see. Somehow, he found himself on the dance floor, Ava's hand warm in his. It wasn't as mortifying as he expected, mostly because Ava was leading, and she seemed far too entertained by his attempts. By the time the song ended, Caleb was almost relaxed. Almost. Then, a camera flash went off. Caleb turned, half-blinded, spotting a photographer looking far too thrilled with his candid shot of them laughing. Faces too close for just business, he sighed. Already dreading the headlines, Ava chuckled. Well, that'll be fun on the morning news. Caleb groaned. I'll fire someone, Ava smirked. You won't, he sighed. No, I won't. The next morning, Henry bounded into the kitchen, tablet in hand. Dad, you're on Twitter. Caleb, half awake, grimaced. What? Henry shoved the screen under his nose. A photo of him and Ava mid-laugh was trending. Captions ranged from billionaire's secret romance to new power couple alert. Caleb closed his eyes, contemplating fleeing the country. Henry snickered. You guys look cute. Caleb grunted. Eat your cereal. Henry shrugged. Okay, Dad. Whatever you say. A beat. Hey, can I call her Mom yet? Caleb choked on his coffee. Henry grinned and grabbed his backpack. Just asking. At the office, Melissa, his assistant, pounced on him the moment he walked in. She held a gossip magazine, waving it with the glee of someone who lived for drama. She smirked. So, anything you want to share? Caleb glared. No, Melissa snorted. Sure, totally believable. Caleb pinched the bridge of his nose. This was a disaster, and the worst part, he didn't actually mind. By lunchtime, Caleb's inbox was a war zone. Emails flooded in from board members, investors, and colleagues, all dancing around the same subject with varying degrees of awkwardness. Some were filled with thinly veiled congratulations. Others subtly suggested AA-approved relationship disclosure forms, as if he had just gotten engaged in front of the entire financial world. Caleb deleted every single one, growing more irritated by the second. His irritation only worsened when Ava texted him a screenshot of a gossip column headline. Billionaire CEO Caleb McKinley's secret romance, merger or marriage. Below the article, Ava had written, "Guess we're famous now." Caleb stared at his phone, torn between disbelief and the unshakable warmth spreading in his chest. After a long moment, he typed back, "Sorry about that. Didn't mean for it to." Before he could finish, Ava replied, "Relax, McKinley. I don't mind." Caleb blinked at the winking emoji. Ava Hastings was going to be the death of him. That evening, Henry pranced into the living room, already in pajamas and grinning like a cat who had just swallowed a canary. "Miss Ava is nice. You should marry her." Caleb almost dropped his tablet. He looked up, horrified. "Henry." Henry shrugged innocently. "I'm just saying. She's pretty, she's nice, and she likes you even when you're grumpy. Plus, she can cook." Caleb rubbed a hand down his face. "Henry." Henry smirked. "You're welcome." Caleb groaned. This kid was getting far too comfortable playing matchmaker. By December, Ava had become a regular at their dinner table. Somehow, without any official discussion, she had just slipped into their lives. And Henry was thriving. The kid was beaming 24/7, constantly dropping not-so-subtle hints about wedding bells, future siblings, and how Dad totally likes Miss Ava, even if he pretends not to. At one point, Caleb genuinely considered grounding him for excessive smugness. One evening, Caleb was halfway through assembling an impossibly complicated toy train set when Henry burst into the living room. "Miss Ava is coming over," he announced, grinning ear to ear. Caleb froze. "She is," Henry nodded. "She said she's bringing cookies." Caleb glanced at the lopsided train tracks, sighed, and muttered, "Perfect." Henry grinned. "Relax, Dad. She's just coming for dinner. It's Christmas Eve." Then, with a wicked smirk, he added, "Please don't mention mistletoe." Caleb groaned. "Henry, no promises." Henry chirped, flinging tinsel at the Christmas tree with the enthusiasm of a caffeinated elf. By the time Ava knocked, the living room was a festive battlefield of garland, mismatched ornaments, and half-strung lights. Caleb opened the door and immediately forgot how to function. Ava stood there in a deep red coat, dusted lightly with snow, her cheeks pink from the cold, a tin of homemade cookies in her hands. She smiled, warm and inviting. "Merry Christmas." Caleb swallowed, "You too." Before he could say anything else, Henry barreled into her legs, eyes locked on the cookie tin. "Did you bring the ones with chocolate?" Ava laughed, ruffling his hair. "Extra chocolate." Henry let out a shout of victory and dashed off. Caleb sighed, running a hand down his face. "You've created a monster." Ava chuckled, stepping inside. I think he was already like that. Dinner was a blur of warmth and laughter. Henry talked a mile a minute. Ava listened to every word, and Caleb against all odds felt completely at ease. That was, until Henry declared that the Christmas tree needed more decorating. "Because ours look sad," he explained, dragging out boxes of ornaments. Ava chuckled, pulling out a chipped wooden star. "Vintage," Caleb sighed. "Cheap." Henry, covered in tinsel, pointed dramatically. "Miss Ava, you put the lights on. Dad sucks at it." Ava smirked. "I'd be happy to," Caleb sighed. This was his life now, and, somehow, he didn't mind. The tree was nearly finished when Henry let out a dramatic sigh. "We're missing something." Caleb arched a brow. "What now?" Henry grinned, pointing above them. Caleb followed his gaze and nearly groaned out loud. A sprig of mistletoe hung above them, mockingly. Ava raised a brow, amused. I don't have to," Caleb started. Before he could finish, Ava leaned in, pressing a quick kiss to his cheek. His brain short-circuited. "Merry Christmas, McKinley," she murmured, eyes twinkling. Caleb blinked. "Are you?" From the hallway, Henry snickered. "You're so smooth, Dad." Caleb glared. "Go to bed." Henry grinned all the way to his room. Later, as the fireplace crackled and the snow fell softly outside, Caleb and Ava sat curled up on the couch. Ava's head rested on his shoulder, her fingers loosely intertwined with his ... For the first time in years, Caleb didn't feel the usual emptiness that came with Christmas Eve. Eventually, Ava's breathing evened out, and she dozed off against him. Caleb stayed still, one arm draped awkwardly around her, his heart beating steady beneath her touch. And for once, he didn't try to fight it. From the hallway, Henry peeked around the corner, grinning, with all the subtlety of a wrecking ball. He tiptoed in and draped a blanket over them. Caleb narrowed his eyes. "Go to bed." Henry winked. "Merry Christmas, Dad." Caleb sighed, rolling his eyes, but as Henry scampered off, humming carols, Caleb couldn't quite wipe the small smile off his face. For the first time in a long time, Christmas didn't feel so empty. For the first time in years, Caleb McKinley felt like his life was falling into place. And that terrified him. Ava had become a constant presence at dinners, at Henry's school events, in his daily routine. Somehow, without him realizing it, her presence had woven into their lives, like she'd always belonged there. And Caleb, a man known for control, was completely losing it. Then, the article started. At first, it was harmless speculation. A few financial blogs whispered about how McKinley Industries and Hastings Corporation had suddenly gone from cutthroat negotiations to friendly business dinners. Caleb ignored it. But then, the headlines turned ugly. Merger or marriage? Did Ava Hastings play the long game? Inside the secret romance of two industry giants, is it love or leverage, gold digger or business genius? How Ava Hastings secured the deal of a lifetime. Caleb clenched his jaw as he scrolled through article after article, his chest tightening with something dangerously close to panic. The accusations were sharp, calculated, and the worst part, they made sense. The timeline, the sudden shift from business rivals to whatever this was, it looked bad, really bad. The breaking point came when a finance blog published a detailed analysis of their relationship, mapping out stock prices and pointing out exactly when their rumored romance had started. The numbers painted a clear picture. Since their relationship had entered the public eye, Ava's company's stock had skyrocketed. Caleb stared at the graphs, heart pounding. Was this real? Had Ava played him? Was this all just a long game for leverage? He wanted to dismiss it, to laugh at the absurdity of it. But the numbers didn't lie, and neither did the doubt clawing at his chest. For 3 days, Caleb barely slept. He buried himself in spreadsheets, legal contracts, trying to make sense of it all. He didn't answer Ava's calls, didn't reply to her casual morning texts. And then, one evening, when she reached for his arm, concern in her eyes, he pulled away. Ava flinched. "Caleb." His throat felt tight. "It's nothing," he muttered, too fast. Ava's eyes narrowed. "Really? Because you haven't looked me in the eye in days." "I just need to think," Caleb said, his voice colder than he intended. Ava stared at him, hurt flashing across her face. Then, her jaw tightened. "Right," she said flatly. And before he could say anything else, she turned and walked out. The door clicked shut behind her. And for the first time since his wife had died, Caleb felt completely alone. Henry cornered him the next morning, eyes wide and filled with confusion. "Why is Miss Ava sad?" Caleb hesitated. "It's complicated, bud." Henry's frown deepened. "Did you guys fight?" "Not exactly." Henry's eyes narrowed. "Did you mess it up?" Caleb flinched. "Henry." But his son wasn't done. "You did, didn't you?" Henry's voice shook with anger. "Why, you promised." Caleb's chest ached. "I'm just trying to figure things out." Henry's fists clenched. "Figure what out?" "That she loves you, stupid." Caleb's breath caught. "Henry." You think she's going to leave? So you made her leave first. That's stupid. His voice cracked on the last word. Caleb's throat felt tight. It's not that simple. Henry sniffled, glaring at him. Yeah, it is. A beat. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, you don't do that to people you love. Caleb's heart splintered. Henry turned on his heel, stomping upstairs. The silence that followed was deafening. For the next 2 days, the house was too quiet. Ava's coat was gone from the hallway hook. Her books were missing from the shelves. The kitchen was eerily spotless, no half-finished cups of tea left behind. And Henry, he barely spoke to him. On the 3rd day, Caleb snapped. He buried himself in spreadsheets, analyzing every deal, every contract, every offer Ava had received. And then asterisk buried beneath a mess of old documents and overlooked details asterisk he found it. Proof that Ava had turned down multiple offers worth far more than his. That she had chosen to work with him, despite better financial gain elsewhere. That she had, in fact, risked her own company's profits to make sure their merger was built on real, stable ground. Caleb stared at the screen, breath stuttering. The truth was so blindingly obvious now that he wanted to punch himself. He had doubted her, hurt her, pushed her away because of his own fear. Idiot. He grabbed his keys, barely remembering to lock the door on his way out. Ava's sister's apartment was across town, just above a small bakery. Caleb parked without thinking, his pulse hammering. When Ava opened the door, her hair was in a messy bun, her expression guarded. The moment she saw him, her face shuttered completely. Caleb, she said, voice flat. He swallowed. Please, just 5 minutes. Her jaw clenched. I don't have anything to say to you. Please, he repeated, his voice raw. Just listen. Ava hesitated. Caleb took the chance to push the folder of documents into her hands. She frowned, flipping through the pages, then froze. Her eyes flicked back to his, confused. What is this? Proof. Caleb rasped. That I was an idiot. Ava's brow furrowed. Caleb exhaled sharply, his hands trembling. I panicked, Ava. I let fear get in the way. I shouldn't have. He stopped, swallowed hard. I should have trusted you. Ava's fingers tightened around the papers. For a long, heavy moment, she just stared at him. Then, she exhaled slowly, shoving the folder back into his chest. Her voice was quiet. I need time. Caleb's stomach dropped. She turned away, the door clicked shut. And for the second time that week, Caleb was left standing alone. Caleb stared at the closed door, his chest aching. He should have known this wouldn't be an instant fix. Ava was hurt, deeply. And all he could do was wait. But waiting had never been his strong suit. Back home, Henry was waiting for him, arms crossed, eyes still red-rimmed from their fight. Caleb barely had time to set down his keys before Henry demanded, Did you fix it? Caleb let out a slow breath. She needs time. Henry's face fell. Then with pure exasperation he scoffed. You really messed it up. Huh. Caleb let out a dry chuckle. Yeah. Henry huffed, shaking his head. Then he turned and stomped upstairs, muttering under his breath, grown-ups are so dumb. For the next 2 days, Henry barely spoke to him. Caleb tried everything, apologizing, making Henry's favorite pancakes, which were brutally ignored, even offering to let him stay up late. Nothing worked. By the 3rd day, Caleb gave up, retreating into his office. The house was too quiet, too empty. Ava's absence was everywhere. And it was his fault. On Saturday morning, Caleb found Henry sprawled on the floor, sketchbook open, tongue poking out in concentration. Caleb hesitated. Henry, without looking up, Henry muttered. Still mad at you, Caleb sighed. I know. Henry's pencil scratched against the paper. You should tell Miss Ava that. Caleb's lips twitched. She won't talk to me. Finally, Henry looked up, eyes narrowed. Did you try saying sorry? Caleb grumbled. Yeah, but… Henry rolled his eyes. You're hopeless. Caleb groaned. I know. Henry huffed, snapping his sketchbook shut. Then suddenly excited he grinned. You need a plan. Caleb frowned. A plan. Henry's smirk was downright devious, obviously. You messed up big. You can't just say sorry and call it a day. Caleb arched a brow. And you have a plan? Henry's grin widened. Maybe. Caleb's stomach twisted. I'm afraid to ask. Henry dragged Caleb upstairs, already plotting. Caleb braced himself for glitter bombs or a PowerPoint presentation. Instead, Henry threw open his dad's closet, tossing clothes like a man on a mission. You're going to her favorite bookstore, Henry declared, shoving a decent-looking button-up into Caleb's arms. You're bringing flowers, he frowned. Not those gross yellow ones. She likes white. Caleb blinked. How do you even know that? Henry ignored him. And you're going to write a letter. Not one of those boring ones. A good one. Caleb stared. You're serious, Henry glared. Do you want her back or not? Caleb sighed. Fine. Henry grinned. Good. 2 hours later, Caleb stood in front of Ava's favorite bookstore, fingers clenching around a bouquet of white lily. The handwritten letter in his pocket felt heavier than it should. From the sidewalk, Henry peeked at him from behind a lamppost, grinning. Caleb shot him a look. Go home, Henry. Henry shrugged. Nope. Caleb groaned, but pushed open the door. The bell chimed softly, and the familiar scent of old paper and lavender wrapped around him. Ava was at the counter, flipping through a magazine. When the door closed behind him, her shoulders stiffened. She knew he was there. Caleb cleared his throat. Ava. She froze for a second, but didn't turn around. What do you want? Caleb's mouth went dry. To talk, please. Ava's jaw tightened. I'm busy. Caleb stepped forward. 5 minutes, please. She hesitated. Then, she sighed and stepped around the counter, arms crossed. 5 minutes. Caleb's heart pounded. He stumbled through his apology, words tumbling out too fast, too breathless. He admitted he panicked, that he let fear get the best of him, that he should have trusted her. Ava's eyes were glossy and narrowed, her lips pressed thin. Caleb's voice cracked. I love you, Ava. Ava's breath hitched. Caleb swallowed hard. Please, don't give up on us. For a long moment, Ava didn't move. Then finally her shoulders slumped. She whispered, You're such an idiot. Caleb exhaled shakily. I know. Then before he could react, Ava grabbed his coat and kissed him. The bouquet of white lilac rushed between them. From behind a bookshelf, Henry's obnoxious clapping filled the store. Finally. Caleb groaned, forehead dropping to Ava's shoulder. Oh my God. Ava laughed, her eyes bright. You knew, didn't you? She accused, glaring at Henry. Henry shrugged. Duh, you guys are obvious. Caleb groaned. Henry. Henry smirked. You're welcome. That night, Ava was back at their dinner table. Henry beamed, eating his pasta like a king who had just conquered an empire. Caleb watched Ava laugh, sip her wine, her presence back where it belonged. And for the first time in weeks, his chest felt light again. After dinner, Henry grinned. So, now that you're back together, Caleb narrowed his eyes. No, you can't call her mom yet, Henry pouted. Worth a shot. Ava snickered. Caleb sighed, shaking his head. But as he looked at Ava sitting across from him, Henry grinning like the mastermind he was, he realized something. For the first time in a long time, his life finally made sense. For the first time in weeks, Caleb McKinley felt like his world was right again. Ava was back. She was at their dinner table, laughing with Henry, sipping wine, stealing amused glances at him from across the room. Caleb should have felt at peace. Instead, there was an uneasy feeling coiling in his chest. Something was wrong. He just didn't know what. That night, Caleb lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to shake the gnawing doubt. Something about the articles, the timing, the way the headlines had been too perfectly aligned. His gut told him that someone had planned this, that this wasn't just bad luck or media speculation. It was deliberate, and if there was one thing Caleb had learned in business, coincidences didn't exist. The next morning, Melissa burst into his office, her usual sarcastic smirk nowhere to be found. Caleb looked up, immediately on edge. What? She threw a folder onto his desk. You were right, Caleb frowned, flipping it open. And then his blood ran cold. Inside were emails, messages exchanged between a journalist and someone inside McKinley Industries. Leaked schedules, carefully timed reports, planted stories. Every piece of information that had fueled the rumors about Ava had come from his own company. Caleb's grip tightened on the folder. Who? He demanded. Melissa exhaled sharply. Carter. Caleb froze. Carter Reynolds, his CFO. His trusted right-hand man. The person responsible for overseeing the financial stability of the company. And, apparently, the one who had orchestrated the entire scandal. Caleb's stomach twisted with rage. Why? Melissa's expression darkened. Because he wanted to kill the merger, and when that didn't work, he decided to kill your relationship instead. Caleb didn't remember storming out of his office, but the next thing he knew, he was shoving open the glass doors to the executive floor, his presence sending a ripple of silence through the employees. Carter was in his office, leaning back in his chair, completely unaware of the hurricane heading his way. Until Caleb slammed the folder onto his desk, Carter barely flinched. Then slowly, carefully he leaned forward, flipping open the pages. His expression remained unreadable. Then, he looked up, calmly adjusting his tie. I see you've been busy. Caleb's jaw tightened. You're done. Carter let out a slow exhale, as if he had expected this. Then infuriatingly he smirked. I was wondering when you'd figure it out. Caleb fisted his hands, every instinct telling him to punch the smug look off his face. You leaked private company information, sabotaged my deal, and dragged Ava through hell. Carter shrugged. It's just business, McKinley. Caleb's temper snapped. He slammed his hands on the desk, leaning in close. You made this personal. Carter tilted his head, completely unfazed. Did I? Or did you? His smirk widened. You lost your edge, Caleb, the second you let Ava Hastings get under your skin. Caleb's voice dropped to a lethal whisper. Pack your things, you're fired. Carter chuckled, shaking his head. You can't fire me. Caleb's smile was sharp and dangerous. I just did. A flicker of surprise crossed Carter's face. Then, he sighed. Well, that's unfortunate. He stood, buttoning his suit jacket. I do hope you know what you're doing, McKinley, because if you think this is over. Caleb stepped closer. Oh, it's over. Carter studied him for a moment. Then, with a small smirk, he picked up his briefcase and walked out. Caleb watched him go, heart still pounding. But the second Carter was gone, a new, sharper dread crept in, because while firing Carter solved the corporate betrayal, it didn't fix the damage he had caused. Caleb drove straight to Ava's apartment. By the time he reached her door, his pulse was hammering, his chest tight with urgency. He knocked once, twice, no answer. He knocked again, harder. Still nothing. His stomach dropped. Was she ignoring him? Or, a cold realization crept up his spine. What if she was gone, permanently? Panic clawed at his throat. Just as he raised his fist to knock again, the door swung open. Ava stood there, hair damp from a shower, wrapped in an oversized sweater. Her eyes were guarded. And the moment she saw him, her shoulders stiffened. Caleb, his breath caught. He had been so sure that if he could just see her, everything would be okay. But looking at her now, he knew that was a lie. She looked at him like she wasn't sure she should let him in, and that more than anything scared him. Caleb swallowed hard. I need to talk to you. Ava's lips pressed into a thin line, then, After a long pause, she stepped aside. Caleb stepped inside Ava's apartment, his heart pounding. She closed the door behind him. The room was warm, familiar, yet suddenly felt like enemy territory. Ava crossed her arms, standing a few feet away, her expression carefully unreadable. For the first time since he met her, Caleb wasn't sure where he stood, and that terrified him. Ava's voice was calm, but sharp. "What do you want, Caleb?" Caleb's throat tightened. There was so much he needed to say, but for the first time in his life he didn't know where to start, so he took a deep breath, forcing himself to speak. "Carter." Ava stilled. "He was behind the articles," Caleb continued. "He leaked the information. He planted the stories. He wanted to kill the merger. And when that didn't work, he tried to kill us instead." Ava's jaw tightened. She exhaled slowly, looking away for a moment, processing. Then, her lips curved into something bitter. "And?" Caleb hesitated. Ava let out a sharp breath, her eyes flashing. "Is that supposed to fix everything?" she asked. Caleb's chest tightened. "I fired him. He's gone." Ava let out a soft, humorless laugh. "And what does that change, Caleb? You still didn't trust me." The words hit him like a punch. She wasn't angry. She was hurt. And that was so much worse. Caleb ran a hand through his hair, frustrated. "Ava, I made a mistake. A mistake." She cut in, her voice quiet, but sharp. "No, Caleb, forgetting to send an email is a mistake. Missing a meeting is a mistake." Her voice wavered, and for the first time, he saw the pain behind her anger. "You didn't just doubt me, Caleb. You thought I was using you." Caleb flinched. Because she was right. That's exactly what he had thought. And the worst part, she hadn't even fought back. She had just walked away. Because she had expected it, expected that, sooner or later, he would push her away. Because that's what he did. Caleb's voice dropped. "Ava, She held up a hand. "Don't." She turned away, her arms tightening around herself. The silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. Finally, Ava spoke, her voice quieter this time. "Do you know what hurts the most?" Caleb's chest ached. Ava took a deep breath, then turned to face him. "I would have fought for you." Caleb froze. Ava's eyes burned with emotion. "If someone had accused you of using me, if the media had twisted our story, I would have defended you." Without hesitation, her voice cracked. "But you." The moment someone whispered doubt in your ear, you believe them. Caleb felt his stomach drop. Because she was right, he had let fear win. And in doing so, he had lost her. Caleb stepped forward, desperate. "Ava." She shook her head. "I don't know if I can do this, Caleb." His breath caught. "You can. We can. Please." She let out a shaky breath. "I need time." Caleb's chest tightened painfully, but he nodded. Because if he had learned anything in the past few weeks, it was that pushing her wouldn't fix this. So he stepped back, hands clenching at his sides. And then, quietly, "I love you." Ava closed her eyes for a second, her expression unreadable. When she opened them, her voice was soft. "I know." Caleb swallowed hard, then turned toward the door. Before he left, he paused. "When you're ready, I'll be waiting." Then, he walked out, his chest aching with every step. And for the first time in his life, he was terrified he had lost the only thing that ever really mattered. The door clicked shut behind him, and for the first time in years, Caleb felt powerless. He had always been a man who fixed problems, who made things right with numbers, logic, and precise action. But this wasn't a deal to negotiate or a contract to amend. This was Ava, and for the first time, he wasn't sure if he could win her back. For the next week, Caleb did something he never thought possible. He waited. He didn't call, didn't text, didn't show up at her door, not because he didn't want to, but because for the first time in his life, he understood that fixing things wasn't about forcing them. It was about proving he was worth trusting again. Henry, however, was not so patient. One evening, as Caleb sat at the dining table staring at a dinner he had no appetite for, Henry slammed his fork down. "Okay, that's it." Caleb blinked up at him. "What?" Henry threw his hands up. "You're miserable." "She's miserable. Fix it," Caleb sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "It's not that simple, Henry." Henry crossed his arms, scowling. "You love her, right?" Caleb froze. Then, quietly, "Yes." Henry's glare intensified. "Then stop being a coward." Caleb's chest tightened, because for the first time he realized Henry wasn't just mad. He was scared, because Ava wasn't just Caleb's person. She was Henry's person too, and Caleb's mistake had cost them both. That night, Caleb lay awake, staring at the ceiling, mind racing. Then, around 3 a.m., he made a decision that terrified him, a decision he should have made weeks ago. The next morning, Caleb walked into his office, determined. Melissa raised a brow as he passed. "So, you're done sulking." Caleb didn't even blink. "Clear my schedule. I need the morning." Melissa smirked. 4. Caleb paused at his door, glancing back. Then, for the first time in days, he smiled. To fix it. Ava was in her office when her assistant poked her head in. "Miss Hastings, there's someone here to see you." Ava barely looked up. "I'm busy." The assistant hesitated. "It's Caleb McKinley." Ava stiffened. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, finally, "Send him in." Caleb walked in, his heart pounding as Ava stood behind her desk, arms crossed. She looked tired, and so beautiful it hurt. "What are you doing here, Caleb?" He exhaled, stepping closer. "I was wrong." Ava arched a brow. "I already knew that." Caleb let out a dry laugh. "No, I mean I was wrong about everything." He took another step forward, his voice steady. "I thought if I gave you space, it would prove that I respected you, that I was letting you decide." Ava said nothing. Caleb's hands clenched. "But the truth is, I should have fought for you sooner." Ava's breath hitched. Caleb swallowed hard, his voice lowering. "I should have never doubted you, not for a second." Ava's lips parted, but no words came out. So Caleb took a final step, standing inches from her now. "I love you, Ava, not because of the merger, not because of the headlines, not because of anything other than the fact that you are the best damn thing that has ever happened to me." Ava's eyes shimmered. Caleb exhaled, his voice breaking slightly. "And I am so sorry for not trusting you the way you trusted me." The silence was deafening. Then finally Ava whispered, "Do you mean that?" Caleb's throat tightened. "With everything I have," Ava let out a shaky breath. And then, before he could say another word, she stepped forward and kissed him. Caleb's entire world tilted. The moment her lips touched his, everything else faded. The doubts, the fear, the mistakes, all of it vanished. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close, vowing in that moment he would never let her go again. When they finally broke apart, Ava laughed softly, pressing her forehead to his. "That was a really good apology," Caleb chuckled, his heart still racing. "I practiced, a lot." Ava smirked. "Henry," Caleb sighed. "Henry." Ava grinned, shaking her head. Then, her expression softened. "I love you too, you idiot." Caleb exhaled sharply, pressing another quick kiss to her lips. "Thank God," Ava smirked. "Now go tell Henry before he explodes." Later that evening, when Caleb and Ava walked into the house together, Henry bolted down the stairs. His eyes darted between them, scanning for signs. Then, the moment he noticed their interlocked hands, he threw his arms in the air, finally. Caleb groaned. Ava laughed. Henry crossed his arms, grinning. "So, can I call her Mom now?" Caleb groaned louder. Ava snickered. Henry's grin widened. And for the first time in a long time, Caleb knew. Everything was exactly as it should be. For the first time in weeks, Caleb McKinley could breathe again. Ava was back. Henry was beaming. And for the first time in a long time, his life felt whole. But there was still one last thing to fix. The morning after Ava officially forgave him, Caleb walked into McKinley Industries with a clear mind and a plan. Carter Reynolds, the man who had nearly cost him everything, was gone, but the damage he had done, it was still there. The merger was still under scrutiny, board members were divided, and the press had turned the entire ordeal into a spectacle. And Caleb was done letting other people control the narrative. Melissa smirked as he strode past her desk. "You look determined." Caleb didn't slow down. "I am." Melissa sighed dramatically. "You're about to do something reckless, aren't you?" Caleb shot her a look. "You know me well." Melissa grinned. "I'll get the damage control team ready." An hour later, Caleb stood in front of the boardroom, facing the most powerful executives in his company. Some were still skeptical. Some were waiting to see him fail. Some just wanted an answer. Caleb gave them one. He laid it all out, every detail. He exposed Carter's betrayal, the planted rumors, the deliberate sabotage. He made it crystal clear that the merger with Hastings Corporation was not only still happening, it was the best damn decision for everyone in that room. By the time he was done, there was only silence. Then one by one board members nodded. And just like that, the deal was sealed. That evening, Caleb found himself back at Ava's place, dinner in hand. She smirked as she took the bag from him. "This isn't an apology dinner, is it?" Caleb chuckled, shaking his head. "No, just a let's move forward dinner." Ava's smile softened. She pulled him inside, closing the door behind them. "I like that." The next few weeks were a blur of adjustments. The media eventually moved on to another scandal. The merger finalized smoothly, stronger than ever. Henry, thriving in his role as the official family matchmaker, made sure that Caleb and Ava never had a moment of doubt again. Life, in its own messy, unpredictable way, had settled. And for the first time in a long time, Caleb welcomed it. One evening, as they sat curled up on the couch, Ava tilted her head at him. "You know what's funny?" Caleb glanced at her, amused. "What?" Ava smirked. "If Henry hadn't picked up that phone call, none of this would have happened." Caleb groaned. Ava laughed. From across the room, Henry, who had been eavesdropping, poked his head in. "You're welcome," Caleb sighed, pulling Ava closer. Yeah, we know," Henry grinned. And for once, Caleb let himself enjoy the chaos. The dust had settled, the merger was finalized. The media circus had died down. Carter was out of the picture. And for the first time in years, Caleb McKinley felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. It wasn't immediate. Healing never was. But slowly, day by day, things shifted. Caleb still had moments where he overthought things, where doubt crept in at the edges of his mind. But now, Ava wasn't gone. She wasn't leaving. And that made all the difference. One evening, as they sat on the balcony of Ava's apartment, watching the city lights, Ava leaned into him. "Do you ever stop working?" she teased, glancing at his phone. Caleb sighed dramatically, locking the screen. "Only when a beautiful woman forces me to." Ava smirked. "Smart man." Caleb pulled her closer, kissing the top of her head. For so long, he had convinced himself that love was a liability, that it made people weak. But Ava, she had proven him wrong. She had made him stronger. Henry, of course, was thriving. With zero shame and a lot of confidence, he took full credit for his matchmaking success. "I basically saved your life," he told Caleb one morning over breakfast. Caleb raised a brow. "That's a bold claim." Henry shrugged. "I mean, technically, if I hadn't picked up that call, you'd still be grumpy and single." Caleb sighed. "Ava," she just laughed. And that sound asterisk asterisk, that pure, unguarded laughter asterisk asterisk, was worth everything. As the weeks passed, Caleb found himself changing in ways he hadn't expected. He left work earlier to have dinner with Ava and Henry. He learned to prioritize more than just his career. He stopped waiting for the worst to happen and started believing in the best. He had spent so long protecting himself from loss, from disappointment, but now he had something worth fighting for. And this time, he wasn't going to let it slip away. One evening, Henry burst into the living room, waving a small box. "Dad, I found this in your closet." Caleb looked up from the couch, where Ava was curled against him. His heart stopped. Henry was holding a velvet ring box. Ava's eyes widened, Caleb froze, and Henry the little menace grinned. "Sue, when were you gonna tell us?" Ava turned to Caleb, amused. Caleb groaned. Henry beamed. And just like that, the next chapter of their story had already begun. Caleb stared at the small velvet ring box in Henry's hands. Ava stared at him. Henry, grinning like he had just single-handedly orchestrated the greatest moment of his life. Caleb exhaled sharply, running a hand down his face. "Henry, put that down." Henry ignored him completely, turning to Ava with an exaggerated gasp. "Miss Ava, were you aware that my father was hiding a proposal ring in his closet?" Ava bit her lip, clearly enjoying this way too much. "No, Henry, I was not." Henry smirked, scandalous. Caleb sighed, standing up and walking toward them. "Henry, give me the ring." Henry held it behind his back. "Nope." Caleb arched a brow. "Henry." Henry tilted his head, thinking, "I'll trade it to you." "If you do it now." Caleb blinked. Ava choked on a laugh. "Henry." Henry shrugged. "Look, I've worked way too hard to get you guys together. I deserve to see this through." Caleb sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "This kid," but then he looked at Ava, and just like that, the world stopped. Because she was watching him, her eyes full of something soft, expectant, hopeful. And suddenly, Caleb wasn't sure why he had been waiting at all. So, with a deep breath, he dropped to one knee. Henry whooped. Ava gasped, eyes wide. Caleb took her hand, his thumb brushing over her knuckles, his heart racing. "Ava Hastings." Ava swallowed hard, her grip tightening in his ... Caleb exhaled, his voice steady, certain. "I spent so much of my life believing that love was a weakness, that letting someone in would only mean losing them." He shook his head, smiling slightly. "And then you walked in, and you changed everything." Ava let out a shaky breath, her eyes shining. Caleb's grip tightened. "I don't know how I got lucky enough to love you. But I do, and I always will. Then, softer, marry me." For a second, Ava didn't move. Then, she laughed, a beautiful, breathless sound, and nodded, "Yes." Caleb let out a relieved chuckle, slipping the ring onto her finger. Henry cheered, and just like that they were a family. 1 year later, the house was bigger, brighter, full of warmth and laughter. Henry sprinted across the yard, his soccer ball flying into the distance. Ava stood on the porch, watching with a fond smile. And Caleb just took it all in. This life, this love, this family. For so long, he had been afraid to want this. Afraid that happiness was something temporary, fleeting. But now, he knew the truth. Happiness wasn't about perfection. It was about choosing love even when it was messy, uncertain, and terrifying. And Caleb would choose this every single day. As the sun set behind them, Ava turned to him, smirking. "So, do I get to call myself Mrs. CEO now?" Caleb chuckled, pulling her closer. "You can call yourself whatever you want, Mrs. McKinley." Ava laughed, leaning into him. Henry from across the yard yelled, "Can I get a dog now?" Caleb groaned. Ava snickered. And as their family laughed together, the world faded into something simple, perfect, and theirs. The end. Before you go. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button, like, and share this video to keep the good vibes rolling and inspire me to create more exciting content for you.